everyone, Clio here, and this is the second video in my sort of like rounding out of 2020 series that I'm doing here in the first week of January. So today we're looking at the worst books of 2020, a controversial video in 2020. But so if you are interested in my most surprising, my most disappointing reads of 2020, then I will guide you towards that video. And then my best books of 2020 is coming out tomorrow. Tomorrow we can gush about all of the great reads that I did in 2020. But sadly, in the year in which I read more books than I've ever read in a year, obviously there are also going to be some that I didn't really get along with all that well. Now, before I dive into the books, I do want to have a little bit of a discussion about the controversy surrounding the worst books of 2020. And I will put a timestamp somewhere that you can go to if you want to skip that whole discussion that I'm going to be doing here. I'm going to keep it relatively brief, hopefully. But around the middle of December there was this whole controversy on book Twitter because some authors had reacted to a video that Gavin from How to Train Your Gavin had put out there of the worst books of 2020. But so some of these authors were really getting down on Gavin for filming a video about the worst books, for putting negative publicity out there for books by authors who had put all of their passion in there, all of their time and energy, who didn't do it for the money but who only did it in order to put this story out there into the world to delight readers, and how especially in a year like 2020 in which it has already been so difficult for authors to get their book out there, it was cruel to put a book like that out there. I'm paraphrasing, so this isn't exactly what the author said, so do take that with a grain of salt going into it. But so the gist of it was that we shouldn't be putting out worst books of the year videos. Now, first of all, these videos have been around for years. They are a staple. Anybody who is on BookTube will definitely consider filming their best books of the year, their worst books of the year, their most surprising and their most disappointing books. Not everybody does that every year. Some years you might also say, okay, I almost have no worst books of the year, so I'm not going to talk about them, for example. Or you might say, okay, I don't really have a lot of disappointing reads, so I won't do that. So there is, of course, it is a staple, but it's not necessarily something that you always do. However, it is definitely an accepted video within the BookTube community, and it has never been under threat until the year of 2020. So I will say, yes, 2020 has been a hard year for everybody, and we definitely love books for getting us through this difficult year, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we can only applaud books in 2020 and we cannot give out negative critiques to anything we've read this year. This year is unlike any other, but that doesn't mean that we have to go into this toxic positivity as a result. My response to this comment would basically be, if your 2020 has been that hard for you as an author and you don't want to see negative publicity about books, or you don't want to see people talk negatively about books, then don't look into that content. The video is titled very clearly, so you know what you're getting into before diving into this video. If you don't want to see that content, then don't seek it out. Then don't click on that video, then don't look at it. Because I definitely think that as reviewers, we have the responsibility to talk about these things. We have the responsibility to talk both about the positive reads we've had and the negative. Do we need to round them all up in a video at the end of the year? Not necessarily, of course. We can just talk about it throughout the years and then forget about them later on in the year. That's definitely valid. However, if you're putting out a best books video of the year, then it makes equal sense to put out a worst book video of the year. Nobody's complaining about the fact that we're putting a video out there of all of our best reads. So why is it such a big problem that we're also informing people about the books that we personally didn't have a good time with? At the background of all of this is, of course, the belief that negative reviews are bad press, but there is no such thing as bad press. Every type of press gets the name of your book out there. Every type of press has the possibility of finding the audience you need. For example, I personally have put some books on here that I know are BookTube favorites. There are some books on here that in the year that they came out, in the year in which most people on BookTube were reading them, they were probably on like 75% of all best books of the year's videos. So opinions are subjective. What I think is a bad book will be a favorite book for somebody else. It's happened a lot of times. And so I, as somebody who watches reviews, I'm also not taking the opinion of the reviewer as some sort of holy grail. I'm not taking it as being like, oh, that person absolutely loved that book, so that must mean that I will also absolutely love it. No, when going into a review video, I do listen to what somebody thinks are the strong suits of a book, what they didn't necessarily love about the book, and based on that I kind of reconfigure that with, you know, what is something that I like in a book. Does that sound like something that will work for me or not? And the same happens with a negative review. There are definitely a couple of booktubers that I follow because I love their personality. I love the way in which they edit their videos, the way in which they talk about books, but they have extremely different reading tastes from me. And when they use words like slow, nothing happens, it's boring in their reviews, I know that there's a big chance that I might like it. When somebody uses the word weird in their review in a negative sense, then I'm like, I like weird, give me the weird stuff. So a negative review is not automatically going to turn people away from a book. A lot of times when you're already excited about a book, for example, and you see some negative reviews out there, you might get more hesitant about a book, but you will still want to read it because you were already excited about it. So I definitely think that you're putting too much responsibility for your book sales on a reviewer if you do that. As long as there have been reviews, there have been good ones and there have been bad ones. And that has always impacted book sales in some way or another, but it's not the case that negative reviews automatically mean that nobody's going to buy your book. A negative review is definitely putting the name of your book out there and spreading it even further. I think that is more or less everything that I want to say about that topic. So now let's just dive into what personally for me have been my worst reads for this year. And I'm going to start off with a very uncontroversial one because this is a Dutch book and nobody knows it, so I'm going to go over this one very briefly, and that is Leigh and Juliette by Annejet van der Zijl. This is a free book that was given with every purchase during Book Week in Belgium and the Netherlands. It is a book about a white Dutch merchant, I think, who goes to the US and who falls in love with a black slave over there and brings her back with him. They are in love and they get married, and it's definitely trying to sell it as a love story. But so this book is like 90 pages long, and so this subject matter is way too complex to dive into over 90 pages. And apart from that, it is also just boring because it is basically not really trying to tell a story. It kind of reads like a 90-page non-fiction, because after reading this and looking into it, it actually turns out that this is basically a study that the author is doing in order to write a full-length novel about this later on. Let me tell you that definitely for me backfires. First of all, I think the subject matter is definitely harmful. These types of stories of white men falling in love with their black slave and the black slave loving them back have been told time and time again. It's definitely centering the white story as well, because he then buys her freedom and he is basically the reason why she escapes slavery. So it's very much also a sort of like white savior story, but also it romanticizes the idea of slavery. It romanticizes this relationship, which is very much a problematic relationship at its core, because there is this huge power imbalance that was there at the start of this relationship. So apart from all of that, which already made me very hesitant about this one, the way in which this summary is then written definitely doesn't make me say, I'm so intrigued about what the full-length book is going to be now, because it was just like a summary and it really was just written in that boring summary style, rather than it being a short sort of like novelization of part of that story that she wanted to tell. She didn't really do herself a lot of good with writing this one, in my opinion. Moving from my least problematic to my most problematic probably, and that is going to be Crooked Kingdom by Leigh Bardugo. So I included Six of Crows in my most disappointing reads video that I did yesterday, but I have to put Crooked Kingdom in my worst reads for 2020, because Six of Crows, while being predictable, I was still along for the ride. I enjoyed the pace of the book for the majority of it. I liked following the story. It was a sort of like nice adventure story that didn't really have a whole lot to it, and so I missed that whole lot to it, but it was still a fun ride for the majority of it, even though it was predictable and whatever. But with Crooked Kingdom, we just got off on the wrong foot, alright? So because something that I just personally really dislike in YA fantasy at this point in time is, you know, I think that they mostly follow the same structure. They mostly have a sort of plot premise that gets you into the first book, and then they either repeat that plot premise in the second one with a sort of like variation to it, and then the third one becomes a sort of like, let's repeat it but put it on a sort of like larger full world scale. Or they do that in the second book if it's only 2 books. So where the first one is a high story which is all just about getting the job done and getting the money, this one is a high story which is all about getting even with somebody who wronged them in the first book. And it has larger word scope because it will have an impact on this entire society. So I didn't like the fact that it was doing that to start with, because I feel like every YA fantasy, YA dystopia or anything like that that has come out since The Hunger Game has followed that structure. And so that I already didn't like seeing, that I already don't like seeing for like the past 6 years, which is part of the reason why I had stopped reading YA fantasy. So going back into YA fantasy and immediately re-seeing that structure wasn't really good, doing much for me. But there was also just, yeah, what I absolutely, you know, something that absolutely makes me respect an author is putting high stakes out there and fulfilling those stakes. Putting those high stakes out there, making the people know how much is at stake, how much could be lost, and actually including some of that loss. However, this one doesn't do that, and as a result, I feel like there are no more stakes. After like 50 pages of this book, all stakes were gone from me, because I was like, yeah, she's never going to do it. She's never going to go there. She's just going to dangle these stakes in front of us and never deliver on them. So there was this stake that was dangled in front of our nose somewhere in the beginning of this book. I think it was in the beginning at least. And I was thinking, whoa, is she going to go there? That would be so amazing, because if she's going to do that, that totally changes the group dynamic, the dynamic of this character and her love interest. This changes the whole dynamic of this character and who this character believes herself to be, the path that this character has in front of her. That would be so amazing. It would totally surprise me. It would take the story in totally different direction than I had anticipated, but it did not do it. So yeah. And then, yeah, sure, towards the end we have one stake being fulfilled, but it never redeemed itself, because from that moment on it was just, I didn't like that it hadn't done that. It was just more of the same that we had seen in Six of Crows, and it was just as predictable as Six of Crows had been. So I need stakes, and I need stakes to be fulfilled, and I don't need them to just be slightly fulfilled at the end as a sort of like negative note along with the victory and things like that. So yeah, sorry. So not for me, not for me. Next up we have Notes from a Small Island by Bill Bryson, my first DNF for the year. So I have read and loved Bill Bryson's work. So Bill Bryson is a non-fiction writer. He has a lot of travel literature, but he also has some more like scientific work. He has a book that's called A Short History of Nearly Everything. That goes into a lot of topics about, you know, the world, how our world works. He has a new book called The Body that goes into the workings of our body, for example. So he has a whole range of non-fiction. And I have previously read A Walk in the Woods by him and A Short History of Nearly Everything. I like both of those books. I had previously tried to get into his what was it called, Made in America, which was about the difference between British English and American English. Couldn't get into that, but I hadn't put it away yet. I just said like, okay, I'm not in the right mindset for that now. Let me just try something else by him now. But Notes from a Small Island was another one of those negative experiences, and so because of this one I've also decided to get rid of Made in America finally. But so Notes from a Small Island is basically another travel story in which we have Bill Bryson, who is about to move back to the US after having lived in the UK for a while, and who's taking a sort of farewell tour of the UK, in order to say goodbye to this country that has embraced him so well and that he has grown to love. However, this book is filled with grumpy old man vibes, and while it was unclear to me also why he was visiting certain places rather than others, what was the appeal about some of those places, and he didn't make those places sound appealing because of his narrative neither. I just couldn't deal with the negativity in this book. It just made me feel very negative, it made me feel very grumpy, it got me very frustrated, and at some point in time I decided to look up reviews and see what people were saying. And so either people really loved it, or people were saying that they couldn't deal with the negativity in this book, and they were actually referencing a scene that I hadn't gotten to yet. So at that point in time I decided this one isn't for me, and I will not give up on Bill Bryson. I mean, I think I will still read some of his. I'm very interested to read his The Body, for example, but I will definitely be a little bit more hesitant going into some of his books, knowing that I had such a bad experience with this one. Next up, another one of those controversial picks, and this is one definitely that also indicates that if you know the reviewer, you will know that this negative review has no impact on your reading experience for this book. That will be Dark Places by Gillian Flynn. Why do I say that? I am somebody who doesn't like detectives. I don't like detectives, I don't like watching them on TV, I don't like reading about them in a book. Why? They are very much centered around the idea of who did it. And I don't care who did it. I care more about what happened than about who did it. So, you know, if you give me a story that ends with a murder, I'm perfectly fine with that. It's not like my favorite thing to read, but I'm fine with that. I'm intrigued about that. But if you give me a story, you tell me this is what happens, and now let's try and figure out how this came about, nah, I'm not that interested in that. I'm sorry. And so, Dark Places by Gillian Flynn. I know I've seen the movie. I didn't really remember much about the movie neither, but I did have hopes with this one because I do love the movie Gone Girl. So I was kind of hoping that it would tie in more with my enjoyment of Gone Girl. However, if I now think about it, having read Dark Places, Gone Girl does not follow that structure. It does not start with the crime and then go back. It definitely is more of a plot forward type of story than a looking back, as this one was. And so I tried it. I got like halfway through this book. I got to like page 200 of this one, but I really had to kind of force myself to read like 2 chapters a day in order to speed through this. And what actually was the parts that I enjoyed most were the parts told from the past perspective of Ben. So this is a story about Libby, who was the sole survivor of a family drama. The only other survivor was actually her brother Ben. However, she turned him into the police and told everybody that he was the killer. Now, 20 years later or so, she is contacted by this group who wants to disprove that theory, who wants to prove to her that it wasn't her brother Ben who had committed the murder, but that it was somebody else. And so we're gonna try and figure out who it was. First of all, Libby is an unlikable narrator, and she's an unlikable character, which I don't mind all that much, but in a type of story that already doesn't really work very well for me, that definitely set me over the edge. But so the main problem with this one is just that I'm personally not interested in this type of story, and so I wanted to try it because I was gifted this book and because I love Gone Girl. But now I know that I would probably like the book for Gone Girl more than I like the book Dark Places, and that is just really, it's not for me. I cannot get into detectives. I don't know what it is about them, but I mean, I don't know how my brain functions differently than most people in that respect, but I really cannot care about who did it. Next up, we have a book by an author that I hadn't read before, and I gotta say it's gonna be more difficult to get into this author now, and that is FranKissStein by Jeanette Winterson. So this is a Frankenstein retelling, as you can imagine from the title. It is told in sort of like dual timelines. We're looking first at the time in which Mary Shelley was writing Frankenstein. And so we're looking at her perspective and the way in which she came up with the story of Frankenstein, with this idea of Frankenstein. And then we have a modern reinterpretation of Frankenstein that I'm not entirely sure was handled very well. There was first of all this sort of implication that transgender people are the new Frankenstein, and that could be seen as an insult. However, in reality, of course, the monster of Frankenstein is only labeled a monster by Frankenstein himself and by people who are ignorant of the reality of this monster. The monster is something new, and so people who see him only see the outside and they make the judgment that he is a monster. However, it is very clear in the book of Frankenstein that the monster isn't a monster. He is very much a human being. He's very much somebody who has emotions, who has doubt, fears, who wants acceptance, who wants these human connections. So making the comparison with the Monster of Frankenstein and transgender bodies, it makes some sort of a sense, and it isn't necessarily an insult, but it is of course dangerous territory to tread. But so mainly the connection we're getting at here is the idea of creating a body and of creating the body we want to see, and how that is the new version of the Monster of Frankenstein. And we take that further than the transgender body. So the transgender body, according to our Dr. Stein, is the new Monster of Frankenstein. It is a body that has been made to serve the needs of its owner. Sounds very weird if I'm saying it like that, but apart from that, but what he wants to do is take it even further and find a way to create these sort of like artificial intelligence, to create these sort of like robots that can then inhabit the conscious of a human being. So it's very much going to be looking at the idea of artificial intelligence and of the boundaries of science. You know, how far can science go? What are the ethics of exploring these types of options? And so in that sense, it is a repeat of the story of Frankenstein, whereas Frankenstein is basically just this scientist who looks for discovery without really thinking about what he's trying to do and whether he isn't going too far in his quest to look for academic recognition. And so that is kind of what is being repeated. However, basically I only enjoyed half of this story. I only enjoyed the Mary Shelley parts. I read multiple books this year that had to do with this subject. I read multiple books that told the story from Mary Shelley's perspective of her time when she was writing this book. I read Frankenstein itself. And so I have been engrossed in this story multiple times throughout the year, and I absolutely loved the writing style for that part of it. I definitely loved the way in which we entered into Mary Shelley's perspective, into her mind, and we looked at that creation. And even in that part, it wasn't really traditionally told, or it wasn't just a sort of like novelization of that period in time, because we definitely are blending time and space a little bit as well within that storyline. And it was also kind of dreamlike in the sense that it seemed like the book was showing Victor Frankenstein as being a real person that Mary Shelley had then been in contact with, that she was actually in contact with the new Victor Stein from the present. So it was unclear to me in any case how far it was actually going with that and what it was actually trying to say about that. But I did definitely enjoy that part of it. However, the present day timeline looked very different. It read very different. That one was told very differently. It was very much told through dialogue a lot more. So the Mary Shelley parts are told from third person perspective. The present day is more like a dialogue style. It's in any case very heavy on dialogue, and it had this huge part about like a presentation of sex robots that were following, and we were introduced to all of these sex robots and what they can do. And I did not see the point of that, and I definitely did not enjoy reading that neither, because it just lasted for too long. It was kind of funny to start with at the very beginning and to have these whole discussions about sex robots and their need and their evolution and whatever, but it just went on for so long and I didn't see the point of that. But so in general, I just really didn't like that narrative voice for that second perspective, nor did I like what the story was actually doing with that perspective, because while there were these interesting elements being brought to the table of the idea of artificial intelligence and its future and its ethics and things like that, I didn't feel like we went all the way with that subject matter, like we went anywhere with it. I felt like we kind of dangled it in front of us as a sort of like idea that was what we were exploring, and then it kind of fizzled out a little bit towards the end. So all in all, it was just a frustrating read for me. It felt like two books in one. And so while there is that connection with the idea of, you know, the invention of Frankenstein, of the Monster of Frankenstein returning in its present day form, since we didn't go far enough with that, in my opinion, that also just felt like a meager connection between the two. And so it was just frustrating. I disliked it. I also had high hopes at the beginning, which of course heightens my dislike for this book, but mainly just the fact that I had to struggle through quite a lot of parts of this book in order for it to not, you know, come true on that subject. For me, that definitely made me feel like, ugh. Especially since there was then that especially since there was that enjoyment with the other part of the book where I felt like there is this potential for me to like this author, but I definitely didn't like the present day parts that Annejet case. And then I also hate this tagline, what happens when Homo sapiens is no longer the smartest being on the planet? That kind of implies that we're kind of talking about a robot takeover or something like that. It does not happen. 2 books left. So let me first talk about Invisible Cities by Italo Calvino. This book went way beyond me, I think. I think there's a lot more to this book that you could enjoy that I just didn't have the energy to pursue, or didn't have the energy to read up on, or the interest to read up on, but that I also just didn't automatically connect to, and it was just boring. It very much reminded me of The Book of the City of Ladies by, don't remember what the author was like, but that is like a book written in the 14th century, I think, that I at some point read, which was a sort of, the idea behind that book was that we were building a city, and every single block of every single brick in that city was a sort of like important female figure. So we were building a city built out of women, illustrious women, which I like, but is not an interesting read. Invisible Cities is looking at these cities and is giving us these descriptions of different cities, imaginary, I think, some of them, or at least I have heard of almost like none of these cities, and it's just gonna do that. It's just gonna give you city after city after city after city. I liked the sort of in-betweens in which we have Marco Polo who talking to Genghis Khan, I'm assuming, or at least to a Khan, and so I like those parts. Because it's basically Marco Polo who is describing all of these cities to the great Khan. And so I like this intermediary parts in which the Khan is reflecting on what he has heard Marco Polo tell him, but I didn't like the cities part at all, and that is definitely the majority of this book. So this was also a big disappointment, because If on a Winter's Night a Traveler by Italo Calvino is one of my favorite reads of all times. It is also experimental writing, but I absolutely loved that experimental writing because it very much went into the meta level of the novel, and it addressed the reader as a reader, the writer as a writer. It talked about all of these sort of subject matters on a meta level. This doesn't go into the meta level of the novel or the meta level of literature or anything like that. And there is definitely experimentation to this, because a lot of chapters have the same name but have a different number to it, and so it kind of plays with a sort of like rhyming scheme where you will have a chapter 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It uses those types of like structuring a lot, but I didn't really understand what it was trying to do with that, or see what it was doing with that. So I don't actually know. It seemed to me quite random when something was referred to as the same name. So you would have cities in I2, but then later on you would have cities in I5, for example. But I didn't necessarily see the connections between the different cities in I chapters. So possibly if you spend a lot more time with this book to try and figure all of those things out, it can be an enjoyable read, or you can really be in awe of what Italo Calvino has wanted to do with this book. But for me personally, it was just such a struggle to get through, and that just made it so that I'm not interested in figuring out if there is some big structuring principle behind this that will blow my mind, because I'm not interested in revisiting anything about this book, because it was such a struggle. I was so bored. I got through it all the way hoping that there was going to be some sort of a redeeming element to it, but in any case, if there is one, it's not one that I figured out on my own, or that I was able to get through just by reading the book. So no thank you. And then the final book that I'm going to mention is, it's not a fully, I didn't fully hate this book. It's kind of the same as FranKissStein, where I felt like I have two very different experiences in this book. I love the part, which in FranKissStein I liked the part. In this book that I'm going to say, I loved a part. So there's hope for this author. There's a part of this in which I was like, yes, this is the book that I want. This is the book that I want to read. However, it's basically a story within a story, and so I like the story within the story. I just didn't like the frame story. So the book that I'm talking about is a book that has got a lot of praise from a lot of people on BookTube as well. So it's another one of those cases where I just really didn't vibe with it, but I know a whole lot of people did. And that will be The Binding by Bridget Collins. So basically my idea with this book is that it is marketed fully in the wrong way. I'm gonna spoil part of this, but I don't think it should be a spoiler. I think it should be spoken of loud and clear that this is in this book because it's going to draw so many people to this book as well. But this is basically a male-male romance, and we don't know that going into it. That's kind of like the plot twist that we need to discover, I guess, in the second part of this book. But so basically this book is about a boy who becomes the apprentice to the binder, and the binder can bind the memories of people into books. And so one day when he is working on a binding, he goes down into the cellar where all of these bound books are kept, and he sees that one of these books bears his name. And so that's the story within the story then, is him opening that book and finding out what is in there. But it takes us forever to get to the story within the story, and because of that premise we know what is going to happen, so it also felt super dragged out before we got there, because it felt like, you know, we were having to struggle through like 150 pages of exploration of the premise in order to finally dive into what we had expected was going to be the story based off of that premise. And so our apprentice doesn't know what binding is to start with. We already know that from the premise, and so we have to do that whole discovery about what binding is together with him, even though we've already been told that in our premise. And so that felt drawn out, boring. Our protagonist is sick at that point in time because he has been bound, and so he's missing part of his memories, and so he is very lethargic at that point in time, which made it extra difficult to get through that part of the story because it was very passive, and that also slowed down the reading pace or the narrative pace a lot. And so that first, I was really so disappointed by that first part, and I was ready to fully give up on this book. But then we get to part 2, and part 2 was amazing. I loved the story within the story. I loved discovering this male-male romance, seeing these two people grow together, these two people from very different situations, these two people who kind of have a enemies to lovers story style, because, you know, one of them is kind of arrogant and obnoxious, and so the other one is kind of you know, drawn away by that, but then in the end they do fall in love and they do have this beautiful relationship. And then the heartbreak of getting to the point in which the binding actually happens, you know, that whole storyline was so perfect because you knew from the beginning that something was going to happen that was going to make him want to get rid of those memories. And so that second part was amazing. 5 stars to the second part, but then we get to the third part. And so we now go back into present day, we go back into the frame story, having this information at our disposal, but basically we're putting another sort of barrier in place, and it seems like we're just drawing out this story for no particular reason. And while there were interesting elements talked about there with binding and with these sort of like manipulations of the art of binding and the way in which people can use the art of binding against other people and manipulate people, it altogether just was such a frustrating read because I so loved that second part and so disliked the rest of the book. So yeah, that is going to be my experience with this book, sadly. I'm still hopeful for the next book by Bridget. But so yeah, these were my worst experiences of 2020. As you can see, there were some books in which I definitely had elements that I liked about them, or elements that made me hopeful for them, because, you know, I didn't DNF all of these. I did get through the majority of them, and so there is definitely something there for other readers. And I think I fairly pointed out that there are other readers with very different opinions than mine about some of these books, which will always be the case. You will always have differing opinions. I don't think that there's a single book out there on Goodreads that doesn't have both 5-star ratings and 1-star ratings. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Definitely let me know if you've read any of these books and what your opinions about them. They can definitely be contrary to my opinion. You know, I've seen more than my fair share of rave reviews for Crooked Kingdom and things like that to know that a whole lot of you will probably love that book, whereas for me it just didn't really work. But so yeah, very much looking forward to dive into my best books of 2020 video and to be able to gush about all of those books, hopefully as insightful as this video, because a lot of times it's a lot more easier to pinpoint what you dislike about a book than to be able to actually point out what really worked for you in a book. But so hopefully I'll be able to manage that as well. But so yeah, hope you enjoyed this video and see you guys for a future one. Bye!